Hey there, true crime fans. Welcome back to For Criming Out Loud and our bedtime series called Crime Me to Sleep. We've been reading while Idaho slept, and this is the third episode. So if you're new here, make sure you subscribe. That way you can go into the playlists and start any book we've covered from episode 1. Let's get into episode 3 of While Idaho Slept. Part 2, Chapter 7. Corporal Brett Payne of the Moscow Police Department was 33 years old and looked like many seasoned military vets from North Idaho, with a fit build and smoothly shaved head. He had served with the Army's 82nd Airborne Division in Afghanistan as a paratrooper and had been a police officer for nearly 4 years, just 2 of them with the Moscow Police Department, where he was awarded Rookie of the Year in 2020. While studying at the Peace Officers Standards and Training Academy, POST or POST, Payne was the first officer in regional history to receive 3 awards for excellence. He had proven his aptitude for the job and shown levels of diligence and investigative acumen that stood out to the small, rural police force he was set to join. Payne had seen death up close during combat in the Middle East, but had never conducted a domestic homicide investigation in Idaho, let alone been the lead investigator on one. That was about to change. He got the call to King Road at about 4 p.m. on November 13th and arrived at the residence to assist with both securing the location and crime scene processing associated with what he'd been told were 4 brutal homicides. The 4 students, he would later learn, had been murdered a full 12 hours earlier. Payne had been late to the scene, but then so had everybody else in the force. The 911 call hadn't been made until noon, 8 hours after the likely times of death of each of the victims. The emergency call reportedly hadn't even been made by either of the 2 surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, but had been placed on Mortenson's phone by one of their friends, a boy named Hunter Johnson, who was the best friend of one of the victims, 20-year-old Ethan Chapin. None of that made sense right away, and like everybody in the Moscow PD, Payne was scrambling to understand what had happened overnight. By the time he arrived, neighbors from all directions had gathered around the house. Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk had been removed from the immediate area. The Idaho State Police Forensic Services team was already on the scene, and several of Payne's colleagues from the Moscow PD were canvassing for potential witnesses. Officer Corbin Smith, one of the initial responding officers, and a young Marine Corps veteran who'd gotten his bachelor's degree at the University of Idaho before becoming a cop, walked Payne through the horrific scene. Payne entered the house through the first floor threshold off the communal parking lot, while crime scene analysts in their disposable hazmat jumpsuits swabbed the doorframe and windows for DNA and prints. He took a stairwell behind Officer Smith to the second floor. The smell of death was unmistakable and already strong. Although his tenure with the Moscow PD had been relatively brief, he had already seen more bloodshed in Afghanistan than many in Idaho law enforcement would see in their lifetimes, certainly more than most rural cops had signed up for. Down the second floor hallway to the east side of the house was a small bathroom, adjacent to which was Xana Kernodle's bedroom. As Payne approached it, he could see a female body on the floor just inside the door, with wounds that appeared to have come from a large knife or another edged weapon. The body, like most bodies in death, was positioned unnaturally and was later identified by a driver's license and other personal belongings found in the room as xanacronodal. Further inside the room was the body of a large male victim with wounds that the nearby Spokane County medical examiner would refer to in reports as sharp force injuries, likely from the same edged weapon. The male body was identified as Ethan Chapin. The blood in the room, spatter and leakage, was extensive enough that it later appeared to have drained to the exterior of the house. Payne followed Smith upstairs to the third floor of the residence, where the bedrooms of Kaylee Gonzalez and Madison Mogan were across the hall from each other. When responding officers had first arrived a few hours earlier, the Golden Doodle, Murphy, had been found shut inside Kaylee's bedroom on the west side of the third floor, spared by whoever had committed the murders. There had been no blood or other evidence found on Murphy. Officers had taken him from the scene and processed him, then placed him in a temporary protective shelter. He was eventually returned to Jack DeCour, who lived just around the block and had slept through the phone calls from Kaylee and Madison and through the murders. Kaylee had reportedly been trying to get back together with Jack the previous night, which he would learn when he checked his phone, and now she was dead. Inside Madison Mogan's room at the southeast corner of the third floor, Kaylee and Maddie lay atop Maddie's small bed together, both deceased. The stab wounds that had ended their lives were grotesque. A large pink M for Maddie rested on one of the window ledges, and beside it, against the window glass, was a pair of pink cowgirl boots. Pink-hued roses decorated the wall around a circular vanity mirror, modern like the kind sold by West Elm. A sleek white vanity and chair sat beneath a dark green faux grass wall hanging with a neon cursive sign that read "Good Vibes," a duplicate of the wall hanging and sign in the second floor living room that Payne had crossed. Twinkle lights lined the ceiling along the wall where Maddie normally slept. On the bed next to her, partially concealed by her body and the folds of her comforter, lay a tan leather knife sheath with the United States Marine Corps Eagle, Globe, and Anchor insignia, and the words USMC and K-Bar, the type of knife, all stamped into the material. A military blade. This was something that Payne recognized immediately. The physical evidence was unusually fortuitous. Homicide investigators didn't often get much of a substance left at the scene. The perpetrator had either planted the sheath on purpose or accidentally left it behind in the pandemonium of committing the homicides. Either way, it was something to work with. While both Kaylee and Maddie had been viciously murdered, one appeared to have been attacked more brutally than the other. Cops called it overkill. It was something that nobody, cop or otherwise, had the stomach to look at for very long. Overkill often implied that a specific victim had been targeted. Chapter 8. Chief of Police James Fry had lived in Moscow and its environs for longer than most, although he wasn't born and raised, as people from the small town often proudly declared of themselves. North Idaho was in his blood after 35 years. A 53-year-old with a closely cropped cut and pleasant, sincere demeanor had gone to high school in Council on the edge of Wallowa-Whitman National Forest, 3 hours south. The junior and senior highs in Council were combined under one low-hanging roof, so there there were so few students in the area. Fry was one of just over 100 in grades 7 through 12. The school mascot was a lumberjack with a red stocking cap and double-bladed wood axe over its shoulder. When he moved north to study at the University of Idaho, the whole world got bigger. Fry stayed in Moscow through a bachelor's degree in criminal justice and a master's in curriculum and instruction. He joined the Moscow PD as a reservist in 1993, becoming a full-time officer 2 years later. He'd met his wife, Julie, now the treasury manager of the city of Moscow, at U of I in the early 1990s. They had 4 children together, all of them grown now, but the family bonds still connected them deeply to the landscape and people of North Idaho. Fry had served many roles with the Moscow PD. He'd been a member of the SWAT team, serving high-risk search and arrest warrants and training for active shooter and hostage situations, and he'd put in extra hours instructing new recruits on firearms and taser handling. After just over 20 years, he'd been sworn in as chief in 2016. He was then overseeing the safety of the small town he'd gone to college in. But he was no small-town investigator. In fact, shortly after becoming chief, he was invited to train with the FBI in Washington, D.C. at the National Training Academy, which accepts less than 1% of its police applicants. There, Fry had access to courses on intelligence theory, terrorist mindsets, and behavioral and forensic sciences, all taught by the leading and most experienced minds in law enforcement. After 10 weeks with the FBI, Fry had sharpened his investigative acumen, and he had made connections in the bureau that he would soon find the need to call upon. Prior to becoming chief, Fry had been captain of the University of Idaho's campus policing division, so the murders of Kaylee, Maddie, Zana, and Ethan hit him hard. 4 of his own had been taken. Not only did Fry understand the nuances of his town and every aspect of its small but competent police unit, having risen through the ranks from the very bottom, he understood the collective heart of the U of I student body. Its pulse coursed through every artery of Moscow, and every capillary was filled with the hopes and dreams of its nearly 12,000 students. This case was personal to Fry. Responding officers and Fry's detectives had been first to walk through the scene at 1122 King Road. Not even wearing booties yet, they'd backed off when they saw the extent of the carnage. It had been obvious that command needed to be called. By the time Fry had done his own walkthrough, his investigators were scanning for tire tracks and taking swabs from the windowsills. His photographers were snapping thousands of shots, and media photographers had already started to arrive in a slow trickle outside. Some of his officers were canvassing the neighborhood for security camera footage, and others were knocking on doors looking for potential witnesses. Still others were carefully combing the woods to the rear of the house and rifling through garbage dumpsters in the vicinity, looking for the murder weapon or other physical evidence that may have been shed in the perpetrator's departure. Inside the house, there was blood on the walls, on the floors, and even on the mattresses in the bedrooms. The bodies remained where they had fallen, slain with an obviously large blade, but not tied up or gagged or otherwise restrained. There appeared to be no sign of sexual assault, something the autopsies would later confirm. The first floor of the residence showed signs of recent alcohol use by the students. Red plastic cups for mixed drinks littered the kitchen, along with empty beer bottles and unwashed dishes. A Jack-in-the-Box bag sat on the counter. The King Road house had been known by policing authorities to be a party house, but it wasn't just the current tenants who'd built its reputation. The 6-bedroom home, so close to campus, had been a partying hub for years. There was a well-traveled path to a glass slider off the second-floor entry and a keypad on the front door that Kayla Gonzalez's sister, Olivia, had told police the students often gave out the code to. So while there was no sign of forced entry, that fact had little weight. The killer could have been a previous visitor to the house, a partygoer who knew, even tangentially, one or more of the girls who lived there, and therefore knew the interior layout of the unusual structure with its unevenly tiered floors and awkwardly placed wrapping stairwells. The 2 survivors, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funk, were being taken good care of by Fry's detectives. They were cooperating, but Fry would have to keep what they had been saying under wraps. One of them had seen the killer, but she could not positively identify him. If the media got hold of that before the police found him, the perp might spook. The crime scene at any quadruple homicide was likely to be complex, but the unusual layout at 1122 King Road and the party-throwing habits of its tenants made things that much more difficult for Fry's crime scene analysts. There might have been hundreds of sources of DNA, fingerprints, clothing fibers, or other trace evidence accumulated over the past several months. Narrowing all that down to a suspect was going to take time and resources the 37-member Moscow PD simply didn't have. Chief Fry brought in the Idaho State Police immediately, and then the FBI, with a team of skilled analysts and criminal profilers who might be helpful. Moscow would continue to hold the reins on the investigation, and Fry would need somebody to be his direct report in charge of that. He knew that Corporal Brett Payne was his guy. Payne was practically a rookie, but whip smart and able to work behind the scenes while Fry handled management of the various out-of-town teams collaborating under his lead, and handled the media too. Small towns didn't usually hold press conferences to update citizens on their casework, but Fry was savvy enough to understand that controlling the King Road narrative was probably better than letting the media run amok. In a city conference room with lights flashing in his face and live cameras rolling, Fry told the press whatever he felt he was legally allowed to tell them during an active investigation, which often wasn't much. It wouldn't be long before the Daily Mail reported Moscow Police Department Chief James Fry gave a blundering press conference Sunday in which he repeatedly could not answer basic questions about the crime. News Nation jumped onto the dog pile right away. It didn't matter to the press that no thoughtful police department in the world would provide detailed information about their investigative progress 1 week into a high-profile hunt for a murderer. The headlines sold, and they sold Chief Fry down the river while the harsh global spotlight illuminated his town and the people he had been serving with for almost 3 decades. Chapter 9. In the Moscow City conference room, lit from overhead by recessed halogen lamps, Chief Fry stood in front of a podium with a single microphone during the presser. He was flanked by his sheriff, his prosecutor, an Idaho State Police colonel, and several members of the University of Idaho's upper administrative staff, including its president, Scott Green. "I am going to be reading from my notes today," Fry said, "because I want the information you receive to be extremely accurate. Over the past few days, rumors about potential suspects, primarily previous boyfriends or creepy neighbors of the King Road residents, had been spreading online, and Fry wanted to make sure there was as little room for speculation as possible, not just pertaining to possible suspects, but to all details of the Moscow PD's investigative process. Unlike Fry, who at times appeared to grip the podium like a gunner on the back of a tank, all the men he had brought with him stood with hands crossed diplomatically in front of their monochrome suits and starched police uniforms, rigid looks on their faces, the way men stand at funerals. "This horrible crime has affected all of us," Fry continued. "The families, the University of Idaho, our community, our country, and our officers." Off camera, the press corps sat elbow to elbow in conference chairs, waiting with bated breath for any information they could report to their audiences. The date was November 16th, 2022, 3 days after the bodies had been found, long enough for the media circus to pull into town and set up their tents. "The facts of the case that we know right now," Chief Fry started, then paused to collect himself before reciting a laundry list of items he believed could be vouched for. "We know that these homicides occurred in the early morning hours of Sunday, November 13th. Around noon, Moscow officers received a call of an unconscious person. Officers discovered the bodies of Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, Madison Mogan, and Kaylee Gonzalez inside the residence on King Road. The four were stabbed with a knife, but no weapon has been located at this time. There was no sign of forced entry into the residence. Investigators are continuing to collect evidence at the scene. Investigators are working to develop a timeline to relevant events. Autopsies are taking place today on all the victims so we can continue to gather evidence and solve the crime. Based on details at the scene, we believe this was an isolated, targeted attack on our victims." Fry sounded short of breath, the pain of what he had just read from his notes, an isolated, targeted attack, thumping in his chest as the press corps leaned forward off their seats. "We do not have a suspect at this time," he continued, "and that individual is still out there. We cannot say that there is no threat to the community. And as we have stated, please stay vigilant, report any suspicious activity, and be aware of your surroundings at all times." Again, his breath was uneven. This was his community. These were the people Fry had grown into adulthood with, gone to church with, thrown footballs and fished with, and raised children alongside. He wasn't warning strangers of a potential threat. He was warning his own friends and family, the people he carried every day in his heart. "At this time, I would like to introduce the University of Idaho president, Scott Green." Fry stepped back from the podium and Scott Green stepped forward, his white hair bureaucratically tidy as he put his reading glasses on. Green's University of Idaho was not the biggest public university in Idaho, but it was the oldest and the one with the most political and social clout in the state. "First, my deepest condolences to the families." Green stopped, fighting back tears, his head bowed over his school-color yellow tie and the prepared notes he had brought along in a manila folder. He pursed his lips. His chin was threatening to quiver. A full 10 seconds passed before he tried to continue. "And friends of Ethan, Kaylee, Xana, and Madison." But again, more tears came and another full stop. His throat cleared. These were his students, entrusted to his care. He had shared his home with them, and danger had slipped through its unlocked doors. Excuse me," he said. He looked around the room as if for a glass of water or another way through the pain that was also visible on Chief Fry's face beside him. Green wanted to address the victims as more than just a glitch in the University of Idaho's dependably low crime statistics, as more than just their 4 names for the press to print. He took a breath and pushed forward. Their loss has been devastating, and they were bright lights in our community and are deeply missed and remain in our thoughts and prayers. His voice sounded like it had gravel in it, the tears building at the back of his throat. Before he had finished, he added, "We just want justice for these victims." Outside, the temperature was in the low 20s, and leaves had started to fall from the hardwood trees. The University of Idaho campus was all but abandoned, students having locked their doors on the unknown world. They ordered carryout from DoorDash or Idaho Eats, delivered directly to their dorms by the new campus robots in the Starship fleet. They streamed shows and waited to go home for Thanksgiving break, which was just around the corner. Many students had already left, allowed by their professors and university administration to skip turning in their homework or taking last-minute tests online. Most had been on edge, in shock, and anxious since the morning of the crimes. There would be time to catch up on schoolwork later. Inside the press conference, Colonel Kedrick Wills, director of the Idaho State Police, approached the podium. He was large, with a fresh cut and commanding presence. "You heard all the university president as well as the chief of police talk about this small community, and it's a very close, tight-knit community, and our hearts break for the families that lost their..." Now even Willis's voice cracked. He had been with the state police since 1996 and has worked his way up through the ranks, from a lonely post as a residential trooper in the farmlands of East Idaho, eventually to ISP headquarters outside of Boise, and finally into the good graces of the governor, who shook his hand and appointed him director 5 years prior to the murders. Wills had a master's degree and had trained with the FBI and Homeland Security, and he'd seen everything nasty and brutal there was to see in Idaho policing. The King Road murders were tough to swallow, but he caught his breath and spoke to the media like the seasoned cop he had made his name as. "Crime knows no boundaries," he said, "and these murders have shaken us to our very core." Chapter 10. Behind the scenes, investigators were hoping their biggest clue, the K-bar knife sheath left beside Maddie Mogan's body, might lead them to the perpetrator. They visited local retailers and sent search warrants to Amazon, Walmart, and eBay for all purchases of the distinctive K-bar with its 6-inch blade and the model 1217 leather sheath they had found. Sifting through the volumes of documents received in return would take valuable manpower, but regional buyers could be identified quickly. The traditional military K-bar had become popular in combat. Its usual stacked leather washer grip allowed for greater control when hands were perspiring or otherwise wet. Rainwater or blood might cause grip slippage on lesser knives. The K-bar also had a uniquely high-carbon steel blade with an elongated groove, so it was lighter to carry than most weapons of its considerable size. The sheath was sent for DNA analysis. During a second round of crime scene processing at 1122 King Road, the Idaho State Police forensic team discovered a previously unnoticed latent shoe print just outside Dylan Mortenson's bedroom door, where she had told investigators the man in the mask, presumably their perp, had brushed by on his way out of the house. They'd found it using amido black, a staining dye that reacts with difficult-to-see blood proteins, turning them dark blue and enhancing their visibility. The shoe print, not entirely obvious to the untrained eye, but made clearer after processing, showed a diamond-shaped pattern facing the direction the perp had walked when exiting the house. Now, along with the knife sheath, which they hoped the killer had touched with his bare hands, leaving behind his biological signature, they had the size of his shoe. It felt like a lot, and it felt like nothing. Even if they grabbed DNA off the sheath, if the perp wasn't already in any of their DNA databases, they'd still have a mountain of work to do. Forensic Detective Lawrence Mowry, a mustachioed veteran, was the Moscow PD's expert in digital data retrieval, and he was put in charge of serving dozens of warrants to obtain access to the victim's browsing history, social media accounts, and cell phone records in an attempt to identify what might have led to their murders. The victim's Google, Facebook, Reddit, Instagram, Snapchat, and iCloud accounts were all examined, and with the help of the FBI, their banking, credit card, Venmo, PayPal, and point-of-sale records were also retrieved. No digital stone that police could reasonably suspect might offer leads was left unturned. The FBI set up a trailer in the gated parking lot of the Moscow Police Department, and from there, agents helped to process all digital and video evidence that was being collected. The feds had generously allocated as much manpower as Chief Fry needed to help study the massive amounts of information coming in. Detective Mowry had also served a warrant to obtain access to Kaylee Gonzalez's dating account on Tinder, but did not initially serve warrants for any dating profiles of any of the other victims. Kaylee was the only victim not currently in a relationship. Despite her bond with Jack DeCour, Kaylee had technically been a free agent at the time of her murder. Mowry also obtained access to her password-protected laptop. After reviewing Kaylee's Tinder account, Mowry sent additional warrants for the acquisition of nearly 40 other Tinder accounts. He also sent one for Maddie Mogan's Tinder account information going back 2 years. Because Xana Kernodle had received a DoorDash food delivery just minutes before the murders, Mowry wrote another warrant to obtain all DoorDash delivery information associated with 1122 King Road. The November 13th driver had been cleared by the police of any association with the crimes, but there were other drivers to consider, and all of them had at least limited access to the house and would conceivably know the girls' late-night schedules. Extensive video canvassing of the King Road neighborhood led to the accumulation of a great deal of security footage from the neighbors and businesses. With assistance from the Idaho State Police and the FBI, Payne's team went frame by frame through the many hours of digital tape. Some of it would prove valuable, and some was just plain gut-wrenching, like the 4:17 a.m. footage from the immediately adjacent neighbor's light socket security camera, shaped like an egg, hanging over their front door. Less than 50 feet from the wall of Xana's bedroom, the camera picked up the sounds of a dog barking numerous times, and then distorted audio of what sounded like a whimper, followed by a loud thud. The $50 camera seemed to have recorded nuances of the murders taking place, which further helped Payne's team nail down the exact time of the homicides. It was another break, and it aligned with Dylan Mortenson's statement that she had been awoken by Murphy barking upstairs. The sound of the thud was hard for the team to get past. The remaining footage from their video canvas in those early morning hours of the 13th took days to be reviewed. The team had hoped to identify the perpetrator's vehicle traveling to or leaving the residence. At this point, they didn't even know if the perp had been operating alone. Perhaps they were looking for more than one vehicle. Dylan had seen only one man, but that didn't mean there hadn't been others. The murders might have been a team killing for whatever ungodly reason. The police department simply didn't know much of anything yet. They had the knife sheath, the footprint, the time of the murders, and a partial description of a man in a mask. That was all great, but why had it happened? And if there proved to be no DNA left behind on the sheath, or no match in their databases, how the hell would they make the leap from here to the finish line? They would need a miracle. Corporal Payne was reviewing the footage from the King Road neighborhood when he saw a white sedan make an initial pass of the 1122 residence at 3:29 a.m. The sedan made 2 more passes over the next 30 minutes, then left the neighborhood. It returned a 4th time at exactly 4:04, just after Xana's DoorDash driver departed the area. The sedan briefly stopped directly in front of 1112 King Road. Then, after a series of awkward movements, as if it had been attempting to park, it continued slowly off camera and was not seen again for 16 minutes. At 4:20, grainy footage of the sedan showed it departing the King Road neighborhood at a high rate of speed. There was no front license plate displayed, and the rear plate was obscured by darkness. But the police department had received their miracle. Chapter 11. Chief Fry held multiple press conferences over the first 2 weeks of the investigation. The pressure from the media was matching the pressure he was feeling inside to work hard and fast and find a suspect, and to find justice for the victims. The day before Thanksgiving, the presser location changed to a staging area inside the modern alumni club at ICCU Arena on the University of Idaho campus. Thinly woven black curtains hung as a backdrop, with direct winter sunlight filtering through. TV crews had entered the building with tripods over their shoulders like pickaxes in the gold rush for coverage. Hairdos filled the audience. Fry spoke solemnly. "We all want to understand why this happened and what drove someone to do this," he said, his cheeks flushed, his dome reflecting light when he looked down at his notes. He made a broad request of the public to continue to submit any information or physical assets, like video footage they might be holding on to, even if it seemed benign. Sometimes what a video or picture doesn't show is equally as important as what might be there, Fry added. He choked up while providing information about a tip line for the case. A few days earlier, he had explained that the task force had conducted over 90 suspect and witness interviews, and that the Moscow PD had assigned, in addition to their primary personnel working the case, 4 detectives, 24 officers, and 5 support staff, while the state police had provided 20 investigators and a crime scene team, and the FBI had provided 42 investigators and 2 behavioral analysts. There were already more than 100 people working on the 1122 King Road homicide case, but the number would soon skyrocket. He introduced Captain Roger Lanier to the podium and stepped aside. Lanier could have been Fry's brother. They looked so similar, both thick-chested with round faces and closely cropped beards, Fry's seeming to have gone whiter in recent days. Lanier was a 20-year veteran with the police department in Lewiston, a nearby paper mill town with the smell from its factory emissions often compared by outsiders to manure. To insiders, Lewiston reeked only of valued industry. He had put in for Moscow's open chief position in 2016. Fry got the job, but Lanier transferred to Moscow anyway, taking his post as captain, and gaining the respect of his new department for what they saw as his calming style of leadership. He hadn't bullied his way to the top, but was a reflective model investigator. In a Facebook video he had posted, Lanier said he had been enjoying his Sunday afternoon at home when he got the call about the King Road homicides. "And it took me a second," he said, his brain having to catch up to what he had been told over the phone. Moscow hadn't had 4 murders in the last decade, let alone 4 in one night. When he arrived at the crime scene, neighboring students were still standing around outside crying, trying to learn who the victims inside the home had been, what exactly had happened to them, and who had done it. First on Lanier's agenda at the presser was addressing the unfounded rumors that had been spreading online about potential suspects. "We do not believe the following individuals were involved: the 2 surviving roommates, the male seen in a grub truck video circulating on the internet, a private party who drove Kaylee and Madison home, any of the individuals who spoke to the dispatcher on the 911 call. We are also aware of a male whom Madison and Kaylee had called several times in the morning of November 13th, and we do not suspect that individual." The police department had not yet released the 911 recording, but Lanier had previously stated that several people had spoken to the dispatcher during that call. He just wouldn't name them. On social media, the victims' peers and even family members would soon leak their names for him. Lanier's job, similar to Fry's in front of the media, was to say only what was prudent to acknowledge during an investigation and nothing more. When he paused again, it was to gear himself up to address what had looked like a lead in the initial days, submitted by those who knew Kaylee Gonzalez personally, that Kaylee had spoken of a man who had been harassing her. "We have learned mention that Kaylee stated she may have had a stalker. Detectives have been looking into that, and to this point have been unable to corroborate the statement." Being unable to corroborate the stalker theory did not mean it wasn't true. In fact, the manager of a vape shop, Café de Vapor, which Kaylee had frequented, had called the tip line and reported that Kaylee and Maddie had previously complained to him about Kaylee's stalker. The police had visited the store requesting security footage. Lanier gave a stern look to the cameras, shaking his head when he told reporters, "Any online reports of the victims being tied and gagged are not accurate." In a few moments, Colonel Wills of the ISP walked to the podium as he had before, and as he would in each presser to come. He patiently explained that investigations take time, and he asked for the media's patience. "At this crime scene, we collected 103 pieces of individual evidence. We took approximately 4,000 photographs. We've conducted multiple 3D scans of the residence, and we have hundreds of hours used by technicians and investigators, including our forensic teams and detectives for multiple agencies. We've processed over 1,000 tips and conducted 150 interviews." Those numbers would rise exponentially as the investigation progressed. Wills took a few moments to emphasize that the King Road Task Force had the utmost confidence in their process, even if that process seemed murky and slow to the press. The task force was not going to sacrifice quality for speed, he told the packed room. Finally, he revealed that the popular Republican governor of Idaho, Brad Little, had been in regular contact with state police and had made a $1 million funding pledge for expenses related to the investigation. Little had been raised on his family's sheep and cattle ranching operation and had studied agribusiness at the University of Idaho. His connection to the people of Moscow went back half a century. Chief Fry eventually took the podium, opening the room to questions, but as with each presser before and after, he reserved the preliminary questions for the young reporters from the University of Idaho newspaper, The Argonaut. Regardless of what was asked in the next 15 minutes, nobody on the task force spoke about the warrants they had served, and none dared mention the white sedan for fear of propelling its now sought-after driver into deeper hiding. Chapter 12. Chief Fry was living what many would consider the good life before the King Road homicides. His kids were grown and moving on with their lives. The land he drove through every day back and forth to work was beautiful, and his wife Julie had been building a heck of a career. Compared to what he was facing now, most of the previous hassles in Fry's life seemed like they had been small ones, like the old Facebook backlash to his department publicly thanking Christ Church for the cookies they had sent. Some irate citizens perceived favoritism to that growing sect of Christianity in town, and they chewed Fry out. In the Moscow PD's official Facebook response to the uproar, Fry pointed out that his people had also recently thanked Subway for their delivery of sandwiches. The public discourse between the police department and its community in Fry's small town had been like family sitting around the table. The passions were high, yet the stakes were often pretty low. People bickered, but the bedrock was love and respect. Outsiders didn't always understand that, and the game had changed on Fry pretty quickly as the King Road case gained national attention. Gone especially was the respect part. Inside the Moscow Police Department headquarters, Chief Fry was repeatedly photographed by a journalist's long lens through the windows of his second-floor office. The photos showed him working on the case late into the night, sometimes scratching his head and pacing. He had learned to close his blinds, but that was not how Fry was used to working, or to living for that matter, blocking out the sky, but also the people he served. As Moscow's mayor had told the regional spokesman Review about the chief, he does not want to be the guy who's front and center. He doesn't want the limelight. What he wants is just the results. But now Fry was operating in a role he wasn't necessarily made for, and certainly wasn't happy inhabiting. The community was starting to feel a pretty strong media intrusion also. In the street in front of 1122 King Road, big SUVs idled in the parking spots, full of network reporters hiding from the cold weather while waiting to grab footage. Normally, those spots were used by the neighborhood's residents, most of them the college kids the press corps had been approaching for interviews almost daily. Handwritten signs in many of the doorways now warned the press to stay away. "We do not want to talk to you," a post-it note on one of the front doors read. Up the street, a rectangular piece of cardboard on a dowel leaned across a snowbank, the words in black marker: "People who do not live here Do not block our driveway. Frustration was growing. Remote-controlled drones periodically entered the airspace above 1122 King Road, lightly swaying in the wind while providing aerial footage of the house for news programmers. The neighborhood was often presented cinematically from above, cameras zooming in towards the murder house, while crime scene analysts on the ground donned their gloves and booties. Meanwhile, Fry was waiting for the knife sheath's DNA testing to return from the Idaho State Police Forensic Services Crime Lab. He knew it would take time, a lot longer than the evidence processing took on television shows like CSI, but he also knew the sheath found next to Maddie Mogan had been prioritized. Many in the task force worked through Thanksgiving Day, continuing to process leads. All weekend, the police station remained a bustling hive. Private citizens dropped off food for the officers, just like the church had done, but nobody gave the police department grief about accepting it. With the students out on break, the town of Moscow felt like a shell of itself. Many of the students might not even return, it seemed, as if the University of Idaho had offered them the option of finishing their classes online that semester, given that the killer was still on the loose. It was an easy pivot for students and professors to make, having learned how to go hybrid during pandemic-related lockdowns. The blinds at 1122 King Road were closed, and its front door was marked by evidence seals, red tape that kept a timestamp of investigators entering and exiting the residence after it had been secured for a period. Each time a new cop came or went, their name was recorded in Sharpie as an additional step in chronicling the chain of custody over evidence and to discourage non-essential personnel from contaminating the scene. The street out front was mostly empty, and the skeleton crew of media that remained away from their families for the holiday did so mostly out of view in their hotel rooms. Moscow more closely resembled what it had been years ago, when Fry and his wife were students and the town population was less than half its current size. But back then, the quiet wasn't from abandonment. The town was known as a beautiful place for stopping by and a better one for digging in. It was a place where people felt safe and wanted to stay. Now it was becoming known almost exclusively for the murders. Bringing the killer to justice might help, and DNA results from the leather sheath could be the starting point for that. DNA didn't always hold up in court, however, especially if it had been contaminated by other sources of DNA from the same scene, which was likely to happen in a house like the one at 1122 King Road, where dozens of people came and went all the time. But Fry and his team were reportedly ecstatic when they finally got the results they had been waiting for. A single trace source of touch DNA, male in origin, had been found beneath the button on the K-bar sheath the killer had left behind. They had hit the jackpot. Sort of. They still had to tie the DNA to a suspect. They ran the crime lab's DNA profile through CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. CODIS holds the entire body of DNA samples from all convicted offenders, arrestees, and detainees. Samples provided by families in assistance with searches for missing persons. Samples from unidentified human remains, and sometimes more significantly, all DNA profiles collected from all crime scenes in the country. The national index was amassed by local government crime labs uploading their DNA profiles to the state indexes, and then the state crime labs uploading their profiles to the feds. The national index is maintained by the FBI, who by now had skin in the game and were as eager to solve the King Road investigation as Chief Fry was. Unfortunately, from the well over 20 million profiles in CODIS at the time, there was no match. The team then submitted their DNA sample to a commercial genetic genealogy service like 23andMe, hoping to get a match to a relative who might have submitted their DNA for more casual purposes, such as understanding their genetic history. It was a long shot, and Fry went to bed that night at his home, 20 minutes from the station, knowing two new things: that his perp had never been in the system, and that justice for Kaylee, Maddie, Ethan, and Xana was still painfully beyond his reach. So that concludes episode 3. If you enjoy this content, please make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you don't miss the next one. You know, all the YouTube-y things. Also, if you'd like to reach out to me, you can contact me through my webpage at forcrimingoutloudshop.com. And while you're there, take a look around. We have some pretty fun hoodies and apparel and things for true crime fans just like us. Thank you guys so much for being here. I truly appreciate your support in this new series, Crime Me to Sleep. Till next time, good night.